addressing the needs of KDA youth and families. It is a privilege today to have with us two of CIMH's senior associates, Pam Hawkins and Margaret Faye. Pam Hawkins is a senior associate with the California Institute for Mental Health and serves on our evidence-based practices team. Pam helps develop organizational capacity to assist county mental health departments and other local system programs to understand, develop, and implement values-driven evidence-based practices, or EBPs as the abbreviation goes. Pam is a seasoned trainer and facilitator focusing on systems change for children and families in need of services, leadership, multicultural competence, and parent-professional teaming and collaboration. She has given legislative testimony, serves on a variety of state and national boards and advisory committees, and is a prolific guest lecturer at local colleges and universities. Pam has over 30 years of experience working in the public mental health field. Also with us today is Margaret Faye. Margaret Faye is a senior associate with the California Institute for Mental Health. Prior to joining CIMH in 2010, Margaret worked as a senior psychologist for LA County Department of Mental Health for 11 years. And with LA County Mental Health, she provided direct services in county clinics and worked in administrative management positions. Most notably, her work was with KDA, Specialized Foster Care Mental Health Programs. And recall that LA County settled their KDA lawsuit many years ago, so that's why you're hearing about KDA work that's done previously. Currently, her primary role with CIMH is to help plan, implement, and sustain evidence-based practices in public mental health settings, as well as DSM-5 curriculum development and trainings. So at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Margaret and Pam. Go ahead, Pam and Margaret.
Thank you, Kim. Now, before, excuse me, I'm trying to advance my slide, and doesn't seem to want to accept. Before we get started, we'd like to find out a little bit about who's in the audience. So we're going to have 3 polling questions just to find out who you are. So please let us know if you're with mental health, child welfare, or other. I'm not seeing the poll on my screen. I'm just wondering if it's showing on other people's screen.
It's showing on my screen, Margaret.
Okay.
It's poll in progress for attendees. Oh, wow, here we go. So primarily a mental health audience with some child welfare and a couple of others.
Great. And second, please let us know if you are A, consumer, family member, B, administrative director or manager, C, a training director or manager, D, direct service provider in either child welfare or mental health, or E, other.
So primarily we have training directors or managers and managers or administrators. I'm assuming those managers are over direct service personnel, a number of direct service personnel, some family members are consumers, and some directors. So thank you, that's great.
Great. Okay, and lastly, we'd like to know if you're implementing EBPs currently. So A, you're implementing 1 to 2 EBPs, B, 3 to 5 EBPs, C, more than 5 EBPs, and D, no EBPs.
This information is really going to help us in determining just how in-depth we need to go with the evidence-based practices part of the presentation. So as soon as we get those results, that'll help us kind of gauge the presentation quite a bit.
Do we have results yet?
Yep. Oh, this is great. So we've got primarily most of the audience implementing evidence-based practices. So very nice. I love to see that. Look at that, 39%. So the majority of the audience is implementing 3 to 5 evidence-based practices. Congratulations, California.
Wonderful. Yes, yes.
Great.
Okay. Now, during today's webinar, we'll go over the core practice model, or CPM, as a system of care framework, evidence-based practice elements, and highlight the similarities between CPM elements and EBP elements. Then we'll also review different EBP models and discuss implementation methods and evaluation. As part of our enhanced collaborative efforts to improve the quality of child welfare services, mental health and child welfare systems have come to an understanding that we need to develop and implement a shared and consistent approach to working with children and family. The CPM demonstrates this best thinking. It is organized around 3 major elements from a system of care approach. First, it is family strength and child needs driven. Second, an emphasis on multi-agency collaboration using trauma-informed approach. And third, it embodies cultural competency. The goal or the objective of CPM is to promote consistent practice that is evidence-based and guided by the values and principles stated above, therefore increasing the likelihood of positive outcomes for children, youth, and families. Now we're going to go over some specific components of CPM. First, the CPM envisions a single system with a unified approach to services, where children and families have their mental health needs identified, assessed, and addressed in a timely manner. In other words, teamwork and collaboration is the key in helping to streamline the process in identifying and linking children and families to effective and appropriate services. There needs to be some cross-training between child welfare and mental health in terms of effective and appropriate mental health services that are available, so that the team, along with family, can develop a single plan which includes all their services to minimize duplication. For example, if a family's court order to receive parenting class and to obtain treatment for their child's acting out behavior, child welfare and mental health team, along with the family, may identify incredible years and EBP that uses parenting group to address behavioral issues to satisfy both requirements. Too often in the past, we see families engaging in multiple treatments that are very time-consuming and at times with competing interests and goals, and that's setting the parent and the child up for failure. Second, go ahead.
In the last 2 slides, what ties the framework together is that it really is all around effective and responsive services. And so, each of the parts of the framework that, we can take apart and talk about, you'll see that it's all around effective services.
Correct. Okay. Now, second element is the shift from organizations, agencies, and individuals working independently to a team environment. This means that the locus and management of services occur in a multi-agency collaborative team and are grounded in a strong community base to help identify natural resources and to provide ongoing support to children and families. The multi-agency team membership may change if needed. The team exists as long as the child and family are involved in services. So here, I'd like to point out many of the EBPs have strong teamwork and community-based approach. For example, one of the main components in multisystemic therapy, or MST, is to help family identify their own natural support and community resources from the very onset of the treatment. and continues to develop that natural resources and community support throughout the treatment. So once the family ends with the MST, they still have that ongoing support. Third, partnership. Youth and families have opportunities to be meaningfully engaged at all levels within both child welfare and mental health. Services are driven by the needs of the child and preferences of the families and are addressed through a strength-based, trauma-informed, and culturally relevant approach. This pretty much echoes other framework work as well. Next, in order for a true multi-agency team collaboration to work, an infrastructure needs to be established to assist the staff of both agencies to work together. Collaborative work occurs at administration and management, supervisory, and staff levels. For example, MOUs detailing collaborative practices, clarifying roles, and scope of work may be helpful. Other ways to promote this collaboration are integrated child welfare and mental health units or co-located child welfare and mental health units. And with this true collaboration, families can thrive, and this can ensure EBPs such as functional family therapy, child welfare model, and multidimensional treatment foster care, where trained and dedicated mental health and child welfare staff are working together to support the family through these respective therapeutic process and to achieve desired outcome. Pam, would you like to comment a little bit on the FFT child welfare model?
Sorry, I was on mute. So there is an FFT child welfare model, and we can talk about this a little bit more when we get to the
Sure.
point where we talk about functional family therapy. But functional family therapy has both a case management model and a therapy model that supports a younger group of kids. And so where FFT traditionally would serve a population of 11 to 18, the child welfare model would serve a population of 0 to 18 with a focus primarily on parenting competencies.
Okay, great. Thank you. And 5, trauma-informed approach. We need to be aware and recognize how traditional service delivery approaches may exacerbate a child or youth's trauma symptoms. The very act of protecting a child by removing him or her from home may be traumatizing. And trauma-informed organizations, programs, and services are based on an understanding of the vulnerability or triggers of trauma survivors, and services need to be more sensitive and supportive to avoid re-traumatization. It is a top-down, bottom-up approach looking at every level and every aspect of the organization and to ensure that everyone has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach, not just the therapist. It is important to look at how a client is greeted at the door by the receptionist or even by the security guard, as well as to look at how policies and decisions are made by management in terms of service delivery. Trauma-informed is a way of doing business, a systems approach. And within the system, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, may be a specific treatment intervention offered to treat trauma symptoms at an individual level. And I want to pause. Go ahead.
Functional family therapy is also a good practice to look at the relational patterns of trauma in a family and really help the family deal with traumatic events or multiple ongoing trauma events.
I want to pause a little bit here to see any questions so far. I gather that's a no. So okay. Thank you. Okay. So next, CPM is a model where data is shared across organizations. So mental health and child welfare organizations are to share information, outcome measures, and goals. They have processes and mechanisms to exchange and share data to the extent necessary for determining progress toward defined outcome measures and goals for the individual children and families. And this is, I know this is a lot of systems work with HIPAA and different department has different criteria. So this needs to be worked out so information is shared to serve the children and family in our systems. And then number 7, under CPM, child welfare and mental health have joint accountability. So we have been talking about key practice domains of engaging, teaming, being culturally sensitive, trauma-informed, strength and needs-based. It is also important to discuss tracking, monitoring, and adapting for accountability at all levels of the system. The child, youth, and family team is accountable for achieving defined child and family goals. Everyone on the team needs to acknowledge that lack of progress or improvement is a system or practice concern, not individual fault. The teaming process provides an opportunity to constantly revisit barriers to progress and to modify action plans to overcome them. And so how do we know when it's working? There are different measures and tools to help us answer that question. At a systems level, there's the Quality Service Review, or QSR. Now, QSR, just quickly, is a very comprehensive review. It's a team made up of stakeholders, mental health, child welfare, and not only you review charts, documentations on the child, but you also actually go out and interview the family, the child, the community, everyone that comes to touch the case, and do a very thorough review on client satisfaction and outcome. And at the treatment level, today we're looking at EBPs and how they help track and monitor progress, again, at a program level as well as at an individual and family level. And Pam will go over this in details. We'll share with you a dashboard report and take a look at how we can track and the data, how the data inform how the program is doing, as well as how the individual and family is doing. Pam, do you have comments?
Nope. No comments.
Okay. This is the last slide on CPM. I want to point out that core practice model recognizes the relevance of EBP in delivering consistent, high-quality mental health treatment to children, youth, and families. It states that evidence-based practices are those that have empirical research supporting their efficacy. Child welfare and mental health agree on the importance of using practices that have proven effectiveness. Both systems have identified a number of evidence-based practices relevant for use in both systems' service delivery. Again, I'm going to pause here to see if you have any questions on CPM elements or comments. If you're typing, maybe you can hit return so that we know that you're working on a question. No questions so far?
Dilberty said who was responsible.
Can you say that again?
Karen Dilberty, she said who was responsible for the QSR?
Who is responsible? The team is, again, if you choose adopt using QSR as a tool, again, the team, mental health and child welfare together, that's again, a system level decision that to be made, and the team is responsible. Both administrations are responsible. Other questions?
That was the only question.
Okay. So moving on, what are evidence-based practices? The American Psychological Association defines EBP as the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. The Institute of Medicine, or IOM, defines EBP as the integration of best research evidence and clinical expertise with patient values. Do these sound familiar? I hope so, because these are very much echoes what we just talked about with CPM values and principles, which are client-centered, culturally relevant, needs-driven best practices. So why evidence-based practice now? We now have a growing body of research demonstrating and matching effective treatments with different target populations and symptoms. There's an increased interest in consistent delivery of quality services as well as interest in outcomes and accountability by funders. Consumers and funders are more sophisticated nowadays in terms of not buying into untested, quote-unquote, best practices that turn out to be not so effective and sometimes harmful to children, youth, and families. And lastly, or simply because we know they work when implemented with fidelity.
One of the examples that we use often is the DARE program, and I know Margaret's heard me talk about this before. Maybe some of you who are also in the audience have heard me talk about this before. But I guess what I'd like to point out is that client satisfaction is not always an indicator of a positive outcome. And we found that out with the DARE program, because if you asked youth and teachers and parents, the PTA and police officers, everyone would have told you how much they loved the DARE program, loved participating in the program, and it felt like it was working because it was a fun program. People enjoyed doing the work and liked it a lot. But when it was finally researched, it actually showed no effect at all. So just be careful about those spreading untested or untested practices. That people may love them, but that doesn't mean that they work. So we really need to test programs in order to determine whether or not there's a good effect. And of course, what we want is a practice that both people love and works.
Sure. Great. Thank you. And why is the effectiveness of a practice important? Emotional, behavioral, and mental health conditions can be complicated and result in significant impairment. The cause of these problems and their treatment are not fully understood. So using a CPM framework, the team, including the family, needs to know which EBP is the most appropriate and most effective. Too often in the past, we put clients in business as usual treatment year after year, and when they don't get any better, and sometimes we blame it on clients being resistant. I think that's a term nowadays people knowing not to use, but it got thrown around a lot. Client being resistant, they did not show up for treatment. So with all the EBPs, they're short-term, and this means therapists need to be accountable from session one and are constantly assessing, is it working? Are the families progressing? If not, what else is going on? Perhaps, for example, perhaps the client's not quite ready for trauma-focused CBT yet. Perhaps the family may be better served by functional family therapy first. The family needs to be stabilized, their day-to-day functioning, before the child can even talk about his or her trauma. And I just want to note here that it is never a good idea to put a child in 2 EBPs. There is a thing of too much therapy, and especially too much intensive therapy. So we would never want to put a child in 2 EBPs. But we often see this kind of sequencing to make sure we're addressing the root cause or stabilize the child before we can move on and deal with other symptoms and issues. So the benefits of effective practices: when care planning involves reference to effectiveness, it will become more individualized because effectiveness is symptom or outcome specific. As a result, expectations are more realistic and hopeful. Imprecise care will be addressed later, so I will skip down to the next one. The ethics concern the need for a provider or system to be aware of and make available services that have demonstrated effectiveness. So presumably, as effectiveness research increases, providers and systems will need to take this into account in providing care. So it is up to us, the providers, to make sure we're up on the current research, current what are the effectiveness treatments out there, so that we can offer our child and family the best possible and most appropriate services. Lastly, it's cost effective. Again, EBPs are short-term effective treatments, which translates into serving more clients in a shorter amount of time with positive outcomes.
So while we don't, and Margaret and I looked around a little bit, we don't really have much, we didn't find any data on cost effectiveness for children in the child welfare system, but there's a lot of data on cost effectiveness in the probation system, and it really is about institutionalizing group home placement, treatment center placement. So when you look at the costs, and you've got the same kinds of court placement costs and all of that in child welfare. But when you look at the cost effectiveness of some of the practices, and I'll just give you an example of aggression replacement training. In Washington State, when they tested the cost effectiveness of aggression replacement training in the juvenile justice setting, what they found was that for kids in institutions who participated in ART, they saved $27 to every $1 spent. And the program is highly effective there. Now, when kids are in outpatient services, they save about $13 to every $1 spent. But you can see that either way, cost effectiveness can be huge. We have limited resources that we can use in California for children and families. And so when you think about implementing evidence-based practices, that's sort of an ethical piece of this. We want to use those limited resources for practices that have more of a likelihood that they will work and work in a short-term time frame as opposed to services that are untested and we really don't know if they work.
Right. Okay. Any questions so far? So adverse consequences of imprecise treatment. So both under and over-service can lead to adverse outcomes. For underserving, outcomes are not achieved. Wasted expenditures of time and resources, unrealized hopes, loss of confidence in the effectiveness of future interventions. And then on the other side, over-serving, where exposing child and family to overly intrusive and restrictive intervention, unnecessary costs that doesn't get you any result, and fosters dependence and undermines child and family autonomy. So effectiveness initiatives view the practice as potentially harmful or helpful and place increased attention on the importance of effective research rather than attributing poor outcomes to family on the part of the individual. Again, it's very much a teaming approach. We need to look at the system, looking at the model, what's working, what's not working, rather than, again, blaming the client or family not being resistant or not doing his or her share. Okay. Now we're getting into levels of effectiveness. It is important to emphasize that the level of evidence supporting the effectiveness is on a continuum, and that over time, the level of effectiveness may be higher or lower depending on research results and future research results. It is also important to emphasize that when the level of evidence is high, the likelihood of the practice can be successfully replicated in a diverse community is also high. Here are the different levels. Levels of effectiveness are not static. We need to be consumers of an ongoing effective research. Again, going back to ethics, that we need, as practitioners, service providers, we need to be on top of the research. The terms to describe points on the continuum vary across authors and groups. So the labels here are not important. The significance of the terms in regards to underlying level of research is important. So when a research saying the model is effective, it means it achieves outcomes. It has achieved the stated outcomes, has gone through random clinical trials, independent replication in real-world settings. So it's not just in the ivory tower in universities, but it's also tested in real-world settings. And when a model is efficacious, it means we have achieved outcomes, gone through random clinical trials, independent replication in study settings. Not effective is significant. There's no significant evidence. There may even be negative or harmful outcomes. Promising models, they produce positive outcomes, quasi-experimental research support, or it's promising by expert consensus. Emerging practice, it's recognizable as a distinct practice. It has operationalized its treatment components based on a reasonable theory or rationale. It's not yet tested, it's emerging. And then we have not evaluated, has not been evaluated, level of effectiveness is unknown.
And what we might add here, when you look at levels of effectiveness, nationally, we have about 10% penetration of effective, efficacious, promising practices. About 90% of what is provided are practices that are not evaluated. So that just gives you an idea of where we are in providing effective services to kids and families.
Right. Okay. And then which level of effectiveness to select? Higher level means more confidence that if implemented with fidelity, similar good outcomes will be achieved. So under the best possible scenario, we do want to offer the higher level models. And you would consider lower level models when there's no alternative for the higher level. Or you're interested in a practice to science service. So it would be put on you to constantly making sure you're tracking results and doing some type of research, knowing that it's working for the target population that you intended for. And then practice to science involves the deliberate evaluation of existing value service that has otherwise not been subject to effectiveness research. So when we talk about different levels of effectiveness or even effectiveness, it's important to look at the quality of research. There is a tendency to assume that if a treatment was provided and there is improvement, then the treatment caused the improvement. However, spontaneous recovery and placebo effects are examples to illustrate events can lead to improvement independent from treatment and tend to be overlooked. So the main point here is that research is helpful in sorting out what works, what doesn't, what does not, and research data indicate positive outcomes from EBPs, showing EBPs, the results that we get from EBPs are due to more than chance alone. That results are actually statistically significant. So an example that we like to use here is the antibiotic example. We know from research, evidence shows that antibiotics do not work for viral type of flu. But and our bodies, we have our own healing ability and process. It takes about a week to get over flu symptoms. And lo and behold, it takes for people who do start on antibiotics, around 5th day they do start feeling, after they take their course of antibiotics, around 4th and 5th day they do start feeling better. So they attribute their feeling better to antibiotics rather than just by chance they will heal with or without the medication. So we do need to look at the quality of research, and if it's randomized, if they are taking different variables into concern and really targeting the specific components of the treatment to show efficacious of that particular treatment component. So all high-level effectiveness models demonstrate the effect of a practice independent of other factors, as I pointed out before, that lead to health independent of proponents' bias in favor of the practice. So we do have to be careful. Quality of research study are variable. So again, we need to be very cautious what we read. And higher level quality research, the greater competence and generalizability of using the model. And toward the end of the PowerPoint handout, we listed websites that have already done the legwork for us that show that will give you lists of EBPs with high level of research and efficacy. And again, which Pam will go over later during our webinar. And I'm going to pause here. This is the first part of our presentation going over CPM, EBP, research, level of effectiveness. Again, I want to pause to see if there's any questions or comments you'd like to add.
Carter Haynes has a question.
Sure.
Do all the EBPs endorsed by mental health and CPS fall into the effective range?
Can you repeat that question, especially the latter part?
Okay. It says, do all the EBPs endorsed the mental health in the CPS fall into the effective range?
CPS.
Do mental health and the CPS fall into, with the EBP, in regards to the EBPs, fall into the effective range?
I'm not sure when you say endorsed by mental health, which guide or which website you're referring to. Again, the websites that the Pam will go over have these levels, and some have like gold standards, like trauma-focused CBT or FFT that have gone through multiple randomized trials and replicating different settings that has highest level of efficacy. So depending on the site you use, I'm not sure. Pam, do you know?
Well, I would think that it's probably specific to each county, and each county mental health department or managed care, the Medi-Cal managed care component may have some requirements or regulations about which evidence-based practices people can use. So there may be counties that will say only effective practices, but there are other counties that may say you can use effective, efficacious, you can use promising practices, and you may be able to even use emerging practices if you're willing to demonstrate that you're collecting outcomes, so that you can talk about whether or not the practice that you can articulate demonstrates a positive outcome. So I think it's probably all over the range, and it probably is specific to county by county. That's the only thing that I can say. The state does not have any guidelines or requirements related to evidence-based practices.
Correct. And your CPM guide, it talks about using trauma-informed approach. Again, trauma-informed, and then it's up to the individual county and agency to utilize whichever model. Again, the CPM is a framework. It talks about ideals, values, and principles, and then it's up to the individual to decide which model, particular model.
Which intervention they're going to use, right.
Amy Price has a question. Just because you use an EBP doesn't mean that they are implemented in the EBP manner.
Correct. Yes.
How do you measure fidelity or ensure that the appropriate EBP is being used with each child/family?
A great question.
Yeah, exactly.
You're really
which segues into our next component. Sorry, Pam.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say great question, and I'll let Pam do her presentation. I believe the questions will be answered by Pam's presentation. Correct, Pam? Or do you want to just quickly answer right now?
I don't think so. Let's see. So, can people see my screen? We did that successfully. Okay, So I'm going to talk about some of the practices that CIMH would recommend for the KDA class, but this is not by any means a comprehensive list. This is just some of the practices that we're familiar with, that we've worked with the developers of these particular practices. We know these practices really well, but there are many, many evidence-based practices, so many more than you would think, that are available to use. There are some great places to get more information, and one of the places I would recommend is the California Evidence-Based Practices Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. And I believe we have the link for that particular site so that people can go look. But they have a very comprehensive list in which they will list levels of evidence, a description of the program, and pretty much all the information that you may be interested in. We've just listed a few here, and I have slides to show on each of these practices. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these practices. So I can't go in depth about each of these practices. And today's presentation really isn't about doing an in-depth presentation on different practices, just to mention some practices. People may be familiar with these. There are a number of people in the audience that are implementing evidence-based practices. My guess is that they're implementing many of these practices, especially for this particular group of youth. So I am just going to start with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. So we talked about this, TFCBT, the acronym for it, so you'll hear me say that, but this is a trauma-informed intervention. It's a conjoint family and child psychotherapy model. So I think that the person who is asking about model adherence, so this is one of those things where adherence can begin to drift, so to speak. And so in this practice, it really was meant for children and their parents to work together when there's behavioral problems that are related to trauma. And what winds up happening sometimes as you drift over time and are no longer implementing with model adherence, that the parent sometimes is left out of the TFCBT practice. And so it's important to monitor all the time using evidence-based practices, fidelity checklists for the specific practice that you're working on. There are a number of ways that the developers have built in checklists for adherence to the model, because what you want to do is stay adherent to the model, because we know by some research that's been done on some of these practices that when therapists delivered the model and they did not deliver with fidelity, the outcomes were actually worse than usual care outcomes, which are worse than outcomes when you're implementing an evidence-based practice. So you want to be careful about that. Trauma-focused CBT is for a population of 3 to 18-year-olds who have been exposed to trauma, and includes their caregivers, like I said. There have been adaptations for Native American children and a Latino population in this particular practice. The level of science for this practice is an effective practice. So basically, again, that means that there have been random controlled trials. They've been research studies that are done by independent researchers. So what that basically means is that research done by other than the person who developed the practice, and they've been done in real-world settings. So they've been done in agencies and counties like your own, the ones that you're working in now. And so that's how it gets this level of effectiveness. The outcomes that have been achieved and told to us by research are decreased child behavior symptoms, trauma symptoms, decreased depression, overall improved social competence. So there are a number of positive outcomes associated with this particular practice. It's a highly effective practice. And it incorporates some trauma and sensitive interventions with cognitive behavioral therapy using some family and humanistic principles. So, I hear therapists say every once in a while, those evidence-based practices, we have to follow a script. And the reality is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as I talk about some of the other practices, that you're really not following script. What you're following is a model. So there are some core elements of a model. And then what it does is it takes from other approaches that you may already be familiar with in your practice. So cognitive behavioral approach and a humanistic approach. So clinical experience is very important when you're using an evidence-based practice. These are also individual family focused. So, you know, as each family is different, the application of each intervention of trauma-focused CBT is also a bit different. It's a short-term therapy. It lasts approximately 12 to 8 sessions. It can be combined in groups, and homework is a component of this particular practice. Highly effective. Lots of people in California actually are practicing TFCBT. I was looking at the people in the audience on the webinar today. I know many of the folks on the webinar, and I know that many of those folks are already implementing these practices. So aggression replacement training, and please feel free to ask questions about any of these trainings as we go along, and Camille will read your question. We'll try to respond to it. Aggression replacement training, another great practice. You'll notice that the level of evidence for aggression replacement training is in a promising practice. This is because aggression replacement training, although it's been highly researched, the research have been quasi-experimental studies such as comparison studies. They haven't actually done random controlled clinical trials that were replicated by independent researchers, and so they land up in the promising practice category. Although people all over the state do aggression replacement training, and the success rate's very high. When you look at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy's website and they talk about cost effectiveness, they also talk about the percentage of time that they can expect a positive outcome. And with aggression replacement training, they expect and get a positive outcome 90% of the time. So basically 9 out of 10 kids respond well to aggression replacement training. We know that not every treatment works with every youth, so we can't expect 100%, but I'd say 90% is pretty good. For cultural evidence, in California, and I'll show you a dashboard report in a little bit, but California keeps a running total of the ethnic populations that we serve. And for aggression replacement training, we serve 49% of the youth are Latino, have a Latino background, 25% of the youth have a Caucasian background, 17% of the youth are African American, 8% Asian or Pacific Islander, 1% Native American. And what we can tell you is when we pull those data out separately for each ethnic group, what we notice in trends across each group is that the outcomes are the same for each group. So we don't see one ethnic group having better or worse outcomes than any other ethnic group. So it's really kind of nice to see that. We do that across all of our evidence-based practices, and I can tell you with all of the practices, it doesn't change. The outcomes actually don't change across ethnic groups. So that's important information for us to know. The outcomes you can expect with aggression replacement training are reduced impulsiveness, reduced anger outbursts, improved interpersonal skills, and then there have been a lot of research with juvenile justice kids for aggression replacement training and a significant reduction in recidivism with this as well. Aggression replacement training, ART, is the acronym for that. It's done as a psychoeducational group. There are 3 specific interventions. So there's an intervention for skills building, an intervention for anger control, and an intervention for moral reasoning. And the moral reasoning, actually, it's a group intervention that uses vignettes to help youth begin to think from the point of view of other people about some of the behaviors that they have. So I think I might have said this is for 12 to 17-year-olds. However, there are a component for 5 to 12-year-olds. It's just the skill streaming component for elementary age. So that is aggression replacement training. Functional family therapy, and there are several different models of functional family therapy. So I'll try to go through this kind of quickly. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But functional family therapy, this this particular FFT has been around for about 35 years. So, you know, the research has been done all along this time. We've known for 35 years that this has been an effective practice. 11 to 17-year-olds who are aggressive, conduct, substance use, behavioral problems. The same thing with the cultural data. We see 43% Latino youth, 21% African American youth, 21% Caucasian youth, 6% biracial, 1% Asian Pacific Islander youth. And again, when you pull out the ethnic groups, you will see the same positive outcome across ethnic backgrounds. The level of effectiveness for FFT is effective. Outcomes, it has reduced arrest, improved family functioning, but there are many outcomes that FFT achieves around family functioning, but recidivism is reduced, in some cases more than 50%. Substance abuse is reduced. All behaviors, substance use, recidivism in siblings are reduced because it's a family therapy model. So it's a nice byproduct of having the whole family in therapy. It's a prevention and intervention-based program, and it includes specific phases. So there's an engagement and motivation phase where in this particular phase, what the therapist is trying to do is decrease negativity and blame within the family. These are often high-risk families with a high conflict. So they're not only decreasing negativity and blame with the family, but they're also reframing negative behavior and trying to reframe that into a more positive or a noble intent, if you will. Once families are engaged and feeling hopeful about change, the therapist would move into the second phase, which is where behavior change would begin to start, and they'll use interventions to work on behaviors that the family needs to and wants to begin to change. And then the third phase, once the families have made some significant progress in changing some of their behaviors, then they'll move to a generalization phase, which is where they learn how to sustain and talk about relapse prevention. The next is the PPP, Positive Parenting Program. Often you just hear this as PPP. The population are parents and caregivers of children birth through age 18. So, and there are different levels of this. I'll go through those. But they've done some studies in Hong Kong, and a prevention trial is underway in South Carolina with a significant % of African American participants. This is old information, so those research studies have been completed. It's an effective practice, so it reaches that level of science that it's effective. Outcomes, decreasing child behavior problems. With PPP, there's a high increase in parental competence, decreased parental stress, and then higher levels of parental self-efficacy in handling home and work responsibilities. Different levels, and PPP is one of those programs that is highly successful. The outcomes actually are fairly phenomenal in my opinion. So it would be worth it to look into some of those studies on PPP if you're considering a parenting type of program. Level 1 is just an implementation that is media-based, so it's an information strategy. You're giving out information to parents. And just giving out information to parents, you will see a reduction in child functioning. Level 2 is a selected implementation that provides advice on how to solve some common problems related to developmental issues. It includes parent tip sheets and videos. It's delivered in 1 to 2 brief 20-minute consultations. So this level 1 and 2, it's a very little treatment that people are getting. In level 1, it's just basically passing out information. Level 3 focuses on mild to moderate behavioral problems. It's more active skills training, and that's delivered through very brief consultation of 4 20-minute sessions. So still you're getting some very good positive outcomes for very little time. Level 4 is for parents that have children with more severe behavioral problems. That is 10 individual or 8 group sessions, totals about 10 hours. And then level 5, it's the same thing as strategy for families and where they have parenting difficulties that they're very complicated with other sources of family distress. And so they include practice sessions, mood management strategies, stress coping skills. There's a standard implementation, and they add 3 to 5 sessions that are tailored to the family needs along with those individual or group sessions. Very positive outcomes, though. This is a great program. Multidimensional treatment foster care. So now you're getting to MTFC. Some of these acronyms are actually, they'll get confusing at the practices, but MTFC, multidimensional treatment foster care, is a practice for youth who are 11 to 18 and are living in out-of-home placement. So it's an alternative to residential group care. Yeah. Hello?
Huh. Maybe just me. I'm not seeing MTFC on the screen.
Oh, you're not seeing it on the screen? Camille, is it showing on the screen?
We're fine, Pam. Keep going.
Huh.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So with this particular practice, we think that more research needs to be done because the primary research has been done with Caucasian youth. This also reaches a level of evidence that it's highly effective. And the outcomes are pretty phenomenal. Decreased hard drug use, decreased recidivism, fewer days in locked settings, significantly fewer days in psychiatric symptoms, and improved school adjustment. So basically this treatment works directly with foster parents, and it's a complicated practice, and so I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to read this here, but it basically works with foster parents. It works with the family that the child eventually is going to go home to. So there are 2 components to this. So you want to keep the child in placement until you can reunify with the family, but you also want to provide the family some parenting skill training so that the transition is successful. Oops. All right, incredible years. I'm sure people have heard about this, 2 to 12-year-old children at risk for school failure and juvenile justice involvement. So this is one of those intervention programs. You're targeting kids prior to them getting into the system. Lots of cultural evidence around incredible years, studies that compare Asian, Latino, African American, Native American. San Francisco's done a nice study where they've adapted incredible years for a Chinese population, for for Chinese immigrants, basically. Level of effectiveness is effective for this practice. Increase in positive and nurturing parenting, decrease in harsh discipline. You can read these here. Again, it's a program that focuses on parent training. There's actually a training curriculum that strengthens child social and emotional competencies. That's the Dinah Dinosaur. I love that one. And then teacher intervention also that focuses on strengthening teachers to manage strategies in the classroom. The next one, parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT. People have probably heard of this as well. This is for young children, so this is one of those intervention studies as well. A lot of cultural evidence with PCIT. 40% of the research participants in one study were African American, but there have been adaptations for Native American children and their parents, and an adaptation for Mexican American children and their parents as well. This reaches the level of effective, decreases behavior problems, decreases in re-reports of child abuse. So once parents are referred to Child Protective Services or child welfare agencies that have the tendency to increase their parenting competencies and not be re-referred. Parents report using higher levels of praise and lower levels of criticism. This model uses a transmitter and receiver. So this is the model where the staff sit behind the glass and coach parents through the transmitter and receiver system while parents are in the room with their child at the time. There are specified step-by-step live coaching sessions with parents. Parents really have an emphasis on changing negative child interaction patterns. It can be conducted with parents, with foster parents, or others who are in a parent-caregiver role. And then multisystemic therapy, MST. This is another family-based intervention. It reaches the level of effectiveness. There's not as much MST in California as there is FFT. It's a similar model, but there are some slight differences in the model. This is also has some cultural effectiveness as well. It's typically a home-based service delivery model. The differences in multisystemic therapy over functional family therapy is that in FFT, the family therapy is always done together as a family unit. And in MST, there's a bit more emphasis on parent training. Brief strategic family therapy, I think this is our last one. This is also a family therapy, and you're getting good results in conduct and emotional problems, reductions in association with antisocial peers, improved family functioning, drug use improvements, and self-concept, and folks are highly engaged in the family therapy model. So that keeps families in therapy. So this is the level of science for this is efficacious. So if you remember, when we go back to that levels of science, so this has not had independent random clinical controlled trials outside of a university setting, so not real-world implementation. So that really, I mean, that's sort of a partial list of some of the evidence-based practices or interventions that can be used within the core practice model, highly effective interventions. You'll notice that all of the interventions are fairly short-term, so it's a commonality that evidence-based practices have. They're short-term therapies. They're designed to get a good result and often move children either out of the system or to much lower levels of care. So any questions about any of those practices? It's so hard to talk to people because I love to see the audience, like how many people are using this practice, and get some feedback that way.
Hey, Pam, we had a question from a while back. It says parent anonymous programs in CEBC and National Certification of Parent Leaders can be mentioned too.
Okay, well, right. So we're focusing on clinical interventions, but I agree that those Parents Anonymous leadership programs are actually very good for helping that component of the core practice model where we're including family members in the child and family team. And so anytime you have a parent leadership curriculum where you can enhance the skills of those parents that are working within those child and family teams, you're just going to have a much more effective child and family team. So it really is about empowering parents to engage in the process, engage in the framework. So thank you for bringing that up.
And then another question from Deborah Bennett. Can ART be used one-on-one with youth or just in groups?
So the model and the research has been done for groups. So what I would say is that if you want to replicate the outcomes from the research, then you would use the group component. Now, having said that, people use evidence-based practices off model. I was talking to somebody the other day. We were talking about, you know, how psychiatrists use medication for children that weren't actually researched for children, and so it's called off-label prescribing, and so we were actually talking about off-model implementation. And so this is what I would say to people. If people wanted to get creative with implementing an evidence-based practice and they wanted to implement it outside of what the research tells us, then I would use a research evaluation protocol to go with that. So I would evaluate model fidelity, to making sure that I was implementing with model fidelity related to the steps that you would use in an ART group if you're going to do this individually. And then I would also use a self-report or a caregiver report to look at evaluating outcomes, to making sure that I was getting the outcome that I intended to get. Because the research doesn't give us any information about it. It wasn't developed as an individual model. So I'm not going to say that it won't work individually, but we don't know if it works individually. So you would have to research it. If you get the outcome that you want based on your evaluation tools, then continue to use it that way. If you're not getting the outcome that you wanted to get, then you would discontinue using it that way. So that's what I would say about that.
Alicia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, Gothill, effective strategies to get CDTs going. Is there a group that is discussing this?
I don't know. That's a good question. That might be a good question for the CalSWIC. I think Phyllis Jerusalem is on the call today, and that might be something that her group might want to talk about. Or she may have other information. If anyone else has information on that, please go ahead and type that in for us. All right. Any other questions about the practices? And if things come up, go ahead and type in your question. I'm going to move on to what we're calling the community development team, but it really is about implementation. So we've talked about the core practice model and how effective practices fit into the core practice model as the interventions that you would use to promote good outcomes and accountability. Then we talked about, why you would use an evidence-based practice, the levels of science, the quality of research, the good rationale for using an evidence-based practice. We talked a little bit about different evidence-based practices, and just to know that that's a small list of evidence-based practices. You can find out more information. There are many more practices that could be utilized, but I want to focus a little bit on implementation of these practices. I want to check my time to see how I'm doing. Okay, so I want to let folks know that, so now you've selected an evidence-based practice, you want to implement this practice. They're not easy to implement. There are a number of reasons for that. We have a system that is used to doing untested practices, and so implementing a different model into a set of, into an agency that already does practice in a certain way can be a little bit difficult. And so the California Institute for Mental Health has developed what we call a community development team, and it's really a dissemination or an implementation process for evidence-based practices. And it's a way that we can help agencies and counties implement evidence-based practices successfully and sustain them over time. So really, what we want to do is help people get these embedded within their agency, change the culture of the agency to accept those effective practices, and then sustain them over time is the goal. We're looking at high-quality model adherent and sustainable implementation. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that part of the work that we do in the community development team really is about model adherence and high fidelity. So it's a training and technical assistance process. And what it does is it combines several different features. So we have pre-implementation strategies where we work with sites to help them get ready to either select an evidence-based practice, or if they've already selected a practice, then to work on what kinds of barriers are in place that are going to be difficult to implement that evidence-based practice. How can we remove some of those barriers, and how can we be ready to implement the practice? Then we help coordinate the clinical training. We provide administrative supports, because in all evidence-based practice administration, we find that the single most effective indicator of delivering an evidence-based practice with adherence and to sustain it over time is a supportive administrative team. there needs to be a champion in the agency or the county for the evidence-based practice to take hold. We do site-specific planning. We offer peer-to-peer assistance in the form of conference calls where several agencies will get together. They'll talk about their implementations and offer each other some solutions to barriers that they've already dealt with and moved on from and had been successful in eliminating. And then we also do what we call program performance. We call them dashboard evaluation reports. And I'll show you an example of one of those evaluation reports when we get to it. We expect in the community development team process that each agency we work with is really committed to participating fully in all training and consultation activities. So developers can be tricky people to work with. It's, they don't want their practices to fail. The last thing that a developer wants is to have an agency implement with less than adherence, like not attending all the training, not participating in all the coaching. And then when the practice doesn't work, people may say, oh, well, that FFT practice didn't work. Developers don't want that. They want their practices to be highly successful. And so they're fairly rigorous in their training protocols and participation from agencies in the training protocols. And so, we can buffer some of that between developers and providers. But oftentimes, the training expectations are rigorous. We want to prepare people for that. So we want to prepare people also that implementing with fidelity is very important. Both aggression replacement training and functional family therapy have done research studies and researched when their particular practices were not implemented with model adherence. And both of those practices got worse outcomes. And so the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time and resource, implement a practice, not do it with fidelity, and then not get the outcomes that you intended to get. And then each agency, we also like them to use the evaluation outcomes. So it's a continuous feedback loop for quality improvement, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. The work of the CET, so we do a lot of coordinating, and we lead the upfront planning, like I had just mentioned. So we introduce the models. We make people we make people understand what the training protocols are. Like I said, some of them are rigorous, and so if you know what those training protocols are in advance of choosing the training, that may help you choose whether or not that's a practice that your agency can handle. And then that also includes what the outcome evaluation component is too, because there are outcome measures attached to most of these practices that are required by developers or sometimes required by counties. Implementation planning, so we do a lot of upfront planning around who the champion is going to be, who's going to practice, how are you going to pick your staff, lots of different things go into that pre-planning. But it really is about helping agencies really think through the practice that they're going to implement so that they are ready to go. Because once the clinical training starts, most developers want practitioners to start training and start practicing those models right away. They want them to start getting practice in the model. So we'll coordinate all the trainings with the developers. We then provide organizational supports. So as agencies and counties are implementing, lots of questions come up, and so we are available to answer those individual technical assistance questions. We're available to help with, understanding referrals, how to fix new referrals, just about everything you can think of around an implementation. We've had so many experiences with implementing so many evidence-based practices that we really have a lot of this knowledge that we can share with people. And let's see, so we address systems issues. Well, like I just said, referrals. Interagency collaboration is a big one, especially around the KDA work. There is paperwork and billing requirements that we can help people with. We understand the Medi-Cal model of reimbursement, and so we can often help people understand how they can sync the two requirements. Maybe the practice has a different kind of documentation requirement, so we'll help people with that. And then we organize that peer-to-peer assistance. And I think the peer-to-peer assistance actually, in my opinion, is probably one of the most helpful things that happens in that CDT model, where agencies get together and are able to talk to each other about their own implementations. Everybody has had some sort of barrier to implementation that they've worked through. Also, we talk a lot about successes, talk a lot about how to facilitate groups, and I mean, just everything under the sun comes up, and it's really nice that people can help each other out on those particular kinds of things. So some of the benefits of a community development team, it increases the likelihood of a successful implementation and sustainability of an evidence-based practice. So, the whole goal is to get a successful implementation. You're spending a lot of money, a lot of resource and time, and the whole point of doing the evidence-based practice is that you're trying to achieve those positive outcomes. And then you want to be able to sustain that over time. And, it just takes a lot of support to do that. We help with developers from being overwhelmed by a multitude of individual agencies. So as we work with a developer, we will have everybody come to CIMH and sort of buffer the developers from the overwhelming requests for technical assistance on particular EBPs. And that's been really helpful to developers, and in many cases has helped those developers implement more evidence-based practices or more of their particular practice than they normally would have been able to do in California, because they have they're able to work with CIMH, and so it's not as much of their time is taken up. So the spread is greater by being able to do what we do there. So, which it says right under there, important for large-scale implementation. Cost savings for CDT. So, again, we talked about you're spending money and a lot of resource and time, and so you want to sustain these. So, using an implementation model is a good way to sustain over time. We also interface with systems at large to support EBPs and their agencies. And so oftentimes when we work with community-based organizations, private provider organizations, we'll work with the county that they happen to be in related to many of the barriers. So some of those barriers might be Medi-Cal billing, some of the barriers may be caseload sizes, and we're very happy to pull in those collaborations and work with both counties and agencies together to be able to move through some of those barriers that implementing evidence-based practices can bring up. So any questions about implementation of evidence-based practices?
Holly had a question. Many of the EVPs are expensive to implement. How are providers finding the funds to pay for them?
So that is a really good question, Holly. And what would be nice is if we could have providers talk about how they're finding those funds, but a variety of ways. So people write grants. They get money from state juvenile justice. They get Title IV dollars to offset some of the costs for training. Many counties support, so LA County is a really great example of supporting evidence-based practices using PEI funds. And so those LA-based providers have really been able to do that what no one else in the country has done in the implementation and sustainability of evidence-based practices. So LA has done a great job. So it really is a lot of different ways that you can do this. Taking training dollars that you may have used for non-tested programs and using them now for only tested programs. So that might be another way. I wish that, again, we had more of an open forum, because I'm sure that there are people in the audience that are utilizing evidence-based practices, that there are things that I am not thinking of in ways to fund these. Other questions?
Donna Thomason had a question. Is this for the counties? Wait one moment. Is this for counties that have not yet started a KDA meeting?
Well, you know, what we're talking about in general is if you've started or not started, what we would like you to take into consideration is when you're working with your KDA collaborations and you're starting your meetings and you're talking about core practices framework and the way that you're going to start implementing the working with KDA youth through the child and family team, that we really want you to remember and take into account that for those interventions that the child and family team can use to improve outcomes with families is to use evidence-based practices. So just to keep in mind while you're planning for your KDA services to include effective practices in those services. That's what we would hope would happen. Any other questions, Camille?
Nathan said, can you speak to the cost of some of the practices, for example, developer fees?
Yeah, so, okay, let me go back a little bit to, sorry about this, aggression replacement training. So aggression replacement training generally trains in a group of people from 5 to 8 practitioners. And the cost of aggression replacement training is, it's a 1-year training protocol. It's $11,000 to train those 5 to 8 people. If you want, now aggression replacement training also has a nice component. They actually have a train the trainer model. So you can train an agency trainer where you can sustain this and you don't have to keep going back to the developer to continue to train for aggression replacement training. And to train an agency trainer, I mean, there are a lot of requirements that I couldn't go through right now because we just don't have time. But the cost is $11,000 for training your initial team. We can reduce those costs if you're training more than one team. So if you're training like 3 teams, then we would reduce that cost. And then it's about $3,000 to train an agency trainer. And then you can sustain on your own after that. So that's an example of costs. But if you're interested in costs for other practices that CIMH works with, then you can always email me, and I can get you some of those costs. And sometimes you can go directly to the developers to get those costs. All right, so I want to show you the dashboard report really fast here. And I got it to work. So this is a dashboard report on functional family therapy. And I just want to show you really quickly what we measure so that you can use this as sort of a continuous feedback loop. So we measure your entry rate, and this is a state aggregate report, but we also give agencies individual reports so that they can see how they're doing outside of how the state is doing. So for California, when kids come to functional family therapy, they retain 94% of those kids. So we're really only getting about a 35% dropout rate. We'd like to lower that. We're a little off from the national standards, but we're working on that all the time. We also collect some client demographics, so we know how many, we know the gender and we know the ethnicity and the age group of the folks that we're working with. We also collect a little process information that really is sort of a proxy for adherence. So even though you may not understand what these tables say, they're basically saying that for adherence on collecting evaluations, you know, we have an 85% adherence rate on that, which is pretty good. We also, you know, this is also a proxy for adherence where the total number of sessions is 14.3 over the state-wide average, and that is within what the model says. This is outcome data, so this is youth who have completed, and what it shows is these are youth outcome questionnaires. It shows significant improvement, a statistically significant improvement from parent figures and from child and youth themselves. So FFT shows very good outcomes. And then, we have some graphs here that are showing outcomes. And then at the end of the dashboard report, there is an appendix that tells you exactly what all of the components are and explains all of that. So that is just a snapshot of a dashboard report. And I'm going to go back to where we were here. Let's see. Just to show you, we have some links for finding EBPs. Remember, we talked about that California Child Welfare Clearinghouse for Evidence-Based Practices. I think that name is wrong, though, and actually that link is wrong, too. I'm sorry. It's the California Evidence-Based Practice Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. But we'll get the right links out for you. And then you have my contact information and Margaret's contact information.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you, Margaret. This is really very informative. So we're reached the end here, and I want to thank you all for your questions and thank our presenters. We will encourage you to take a few minutes to fill out the feedback as you exit this session, and as we mentioned earlier, we will be sending out a revised version of these slides so you have the correct links and one of the last slides. So once again, please fill out the feedback form, and we will conclude our broadcast. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.